So cultural exegesis. Last week, we ended talking about the historical context. The historical context, let's just review for a minute. The historical context has to do with the history that is either in the passage itself that we can read about or behind the passage, like the world of the passage. Sometimes our passages will have names or places or events, and we need to go investigate those, especially if we do not know them very well. The more time you spend in the Bible, the more time you can, or the more you will understand and recognize different names. But there's always things that you can learn about the history of a passage. If we're looking at the book as a whole, we want to investigate things like who wrote the book, if we know that. Some books we don't know. Some are anonymous. Who wrote the book? When was the book written? To whom? Or who is the audience or the recipients of the book? Sometimes we do not know that. It may be only that we have very broad understandings of some of those things, especially like Old Testament books. We may only know that, like Jeremiah was written to people who were about to go into exile, or the book itself may have been written as people were in exile. That's the final result of the prophecies that Jeremiah spoke. We can know a few things about Jeremiah. We can know about the history of what was going on because we can look at other books of the Bible like 2 Kings or 2 Chronicles that tell us about the time, about that period of time. So there's things that we can learn about the history. The history will give us a context. Words always have meaning in a context. And one of those contexts then is the historical setting. The historical setting can give us clues to help us understand, especially what is timeless truth and what is time-bound truth. Remember, that's one of the key questions that we need to ask ourselves. Is this passage meant for a specific time and situation, or is it a universal truth that's valid for all times and all situations? We would probably say that, for example, the historical books of the Old Testament, they are very time specific. They are stories about a very specific time in history. It can be challenging to find the timeless truth behind some of those stories. Behind every passage, there will be a timeless truth. Another word for that is prescriptive truth. It gives a truth that is valid for all times and all situations. That's our big challenge. So understanding the history will help us to determine that. Another context that we need to look at is called cultural context. Cultural context is very much an aspect of historical context. It's talking about the world of the Bible. All people come from a certain place and time, which determine a lot about how they view the world around them. By studying the culture from which people come, we can better understand the words that they speak or write. Sometimes we want to take our own cultural context, and that's part of that word called eisegesis, where we bring our own ideas and we put them into the Bible. Well, one way that we can avoid that is understanding the culture of the Bible. that will help us so that we don't bring our own culture and impose or push that into the passage. The more we can become aware of the questions to ask, the more we can be prepared to change our own perspective or worldview. We will find as we study the Bible that our own culture, our own worldview will be critiqued, and that we will have to make some adjustment in that. And our worldview will become more of a biblical worldview and not just something that's just from the world today. The big challenge for us then is to learn to ask good questions. So there'll be some specific questions that I have here in the notes related to cultural context. Part of the world behind the text involves investigating the culture in which the author and the audience lived. This can be a challenging type of area to interpret. There's a few things we can pick up directly from the passages, but there's other things that we may have to go do a little bit of research. Fortunately, there have been a lot of books that have been written on the culture of the Bible, and there's more and more every year, and many of those have a lot of helpful information. We can learn a lot about the cultures of the Bible. There's not just one culture. There's many cultures that are talked about in the Bible. Probably 100 different cultures or more. We can learn about those cultures, first of all, by looking in the Bible. Second, we can look at archaeology and what we can learn from archaeology. Third, we can look at other ancient texts if we have those resources. Sometimes, especially Old Testament, there's not a lot of other ancient writings for us to look at. New Testament, we have more. Another way for us to do this is that we can just simply ask broad questions and then see if we can find some information in the passage itself or in the book. So here are some things that will guide us, some words. Worldview. A worldview, the general values or outlook of those in the text or in a society at large. It's the way people view their world. It's how they make decisions and how they choose to live. That's called the worldview. Social structures. These are things like marriage and family patterns, the roles of men and women. Example from the Old Testament. Married women without children were looked down upon. They were shamed. If a woman did not have a child, it was very shameful in the ancient Old Testament cultures. Physical features. We can look at things like the climate, the weather, and how people moved around, transportation. Obviously, they did not have high-speed trains back then. Did they walk everywhere? Did they ride camels or donkeys or horses or chariots? Sometimes those can be clues to us. Economic structures. These are how people made a living. Wealth versus poverty, slavery, economic mobility. And then the political climate. We can look at how the government was set up, governing structures. Some places there was no king. We read about that in the book of Judges, and they had all kinds of problems. In other places in the Old Testament, we read about how they had kings, but they're all evil. In the New Testament, the governing structure was Rome. You know, they were the dominating empire. All of those things will influence our interpretation. Also, we see loyalties among groups and leaders, behavior patterns, customs, and dress. These are all the things we can kind of look for. And then religious structures. How did people practice their faith? That's a big one in the Old Testament because we see a lot of idolatry and worship of Baals and Ashtoreths and immorality and things like that. There were power centers. Jerusalem, Bethel, places like that, Shiloh. Beliefs, rituals, and affiliations. Let's look at, I think I have outlined here 8 areas that we can use. Now, not all of these will fit your passage. You may only have one of these areas that might be relevant to your passage. Some passages are more difficult to find any cultural context. Don't give up. It just means you might have to look wider. It may not be your little paragraph, but you might have to look at the chapter or perhaps the entire book to get a better idea of the cultural context. So the first area, worldview questions. The goal of cultural exegesis is to understand the worldviews in the biblical text. A person's worldview is influenced by culture, location, family, beliefs, language, and other things. So worldview, here are some questions you can ask when it comes to the worldview. How is the worldview of the biblical writer similar to or different from the modern worldview? That's a good one to think about. How is the worldview of my passage different from mine? How about the view of my own culture? Scientific and mechanistic cultures view the world in terms of matter, energy, cause, and effect. The biblical worldview, reality, in terms of spirits or spiritual powers as agents of causality. How does the biblical worldview shed light on my passage? Now, I know in some places in the Philippines, people still think in the terms of spirits, the spirit world, spiritual powers. That's going to probably be a little different if you're out in the province than if you are in Metro Manila, which probably is more scientific and mechanistic. It is helpful to realize that probably the province or out in the island is probably closer to the biblical worldview and culture than the massive cities that we have. So that's something to think about. Do I understand the culture of the Bible, and how does that culture compare to where I'm at right now? So we have to avoid being so locked into our own worldview that we can't see the world of the Bible. We have to set aside our worldview and try to approach the text from the worldview of the Bible. The more you study the Bible, the more you'll understand the worldview of the ancient people. How did the biblical world generally understand the sources of matter and energy? How were cause and effect understood? Since the culture of the biblical world was basically animistic and believed that spirits were the cause agents of all reality, how does this relate to my own understanding of the world? So we have to be careful that we don't push a modern scientific worldview onto the ancient text. Otherwise, we may end up like, you remember in the history of interpretation, some of those 19th century European liberals, like from Germany and so on, they pushed their scientific worldview on the Bible. Well, we can't do that. We have to come from the perspective of the Bible. So we've got to be careful that we understand our own worldview also. So try to understand the worldview of the Bible. It may even be a little different from the Old Testament to the New Testament. There's still a lot of things shared, but it's going to be a little different. It's also going to be different, for example, in Palestine or in Israel compared to like the city of Rome or Ephesus. You know, some of those Roman cities going to be a lot different than what the people were like in Jerusalem. The next area is called value and meaning questions. We tend to create value and thus meaning from power. The biblical world tended to give meaning on the basis of status. So we've got power versus status. Honor and shame played a major role in establishing and controlling status. Purity, order, doing what was appropriate, these were highly valued in the biblical world more than they are today. So here's some questions we can ask. How was value and meaning established in the biblical world compared to our world? How do the assumptions about value and meaning work in my passage? So here are some values from the ancient world. Some of these you may just know. For example, village life and having a small circle of known people. Most people never traveled outside their village. They lived their entire life right in their little village. Everything that they knew was right there in their village. And so we would expect that people put high value in family. Family is very important. We can read about that in the Old Testament. The goal was to increase one's status, which consisted in increasing honor or bringing honor upon oneself. Or we could say here also, bring honor to one's family. What happens if someone brought shame to your family back in the ancient world? Well, they called it revenge. You go out and kill whoever brought dishonor to your family. So people did whatever they could to avoid shame. To increase in honor, others usually were shamed. So honor is what is called a limited, limited good. That's what the anthropologists call it, a limited good. If someone gets honor, someone is going to be dishonored. It's just kind of the way things worked. So to be honored, someone would be shamed. Another important cultural feature that we see many places throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, is called patron and client, or sponsorship. Power and position determine relationships. So certain people had power. It may be the wealthy. It may be those who had positions or the leaders in the village. And so they became the patrons. I see that a lot in the Philippines, actually. I think the word is, I hear a lot of as sponsors. So if you are the mayor of a barangay, you're going to be everyone's patron, and they become your client. Well, you can take that kind of thinking and look for it in the Bible because it's very common in those cultures. Another one is called limited goods. There's only so much to go around. If someone got something, someone else suffered. And then, finally, certain taboos. A taboo is something that you should not do. You must avoid it. Whatever is considered a taboo was determined by the culture. We can look for those taboos, those things to avoid. Oftentimes, writers like Paul the Apostle, he will list the taboos in his letters. These are the things that you should avoid. Don't do these things. So he is creating a boundary for the church so that they know what it means to be a believer. So he was creating these boundaries. So we can look for those boundaries. Oftentimes, the biblical writers will challenge the common worldviews around them. Jesus did this a lot. He challenged the way the Jews were living, especially the Jewish leaders. And he was creating his own new value system for what it means to be a disciple. So we can look at this. Cultural exegesis, by the way, can be really insightful if you learn to look for these kinds of questions. Another area is called sociological and psychological questions. How did the biblical writer view the nature of human beings from both a psychological and sociological perspective? So psychologically, a person was a psychosomatic unity. In other words, they were one person. The Bible would talk about body, soul, and spirit, but it's all who we are. The Greeks were more of a culture where they had the immortal spirit and then the fleshly body. So they saw the human as two parts. But in the Hebrew mindset, people were at one unity. We are who we are. Sociologically, the group was the unit of social reality rather than the individual. In some Western cultures today, it's very individualized. I think in many Asian cultures, it's still the group is important. In the biblical world, the group was important. And you wanted to do what you could to stay in the group and to be accepted by the group. How do these perspectives on human nature affect our understanding of the text? So you think of these things and you look for them in your passage. Here are some ways to think about this. The group, the biblical culture was dyadic. This word dyadic is where the group rather than the individual is the primary unit of society. The group defined your self-worth, who you are, your honor, your shame. So people wanted to be associated with a group. For example, in the Old Testament, we read over and over again that people were part of a tribe. You know, I am the tribe of Benjamin. Even we see this even in the New Testament, and this is like almost 2,000 years after the patriarchs, and they still find their identity in these ancient tribes and families. The individual. The history of Christian thought very early adopted a Platonistic dualism to speak of the essence of human beings, the body-soul dichotomy. That means separation of the Greek philosophy. It passed uncritically into the Christian discourse by the end of the 2nd century. And we've had that with us now for 2,000 years. There's also some who become trichotomist, who divide the human into three pieces, body, soul, and spirit. But in the Bible, actually, the person is a unit. We are who we are. You can talk about body, soul, and spirit, but whatever happens to my body affects my spirit. Whatever happens to my spirit affects my body. So the Hebrew people thought more holistically. And that raises the difficult question, well, what does these terms, body, soul, spirit, heart, mind, and all the other terms, what do they mean? When you see these words in your passage or in the Bible, you need to think carefully. What is this biblical author trying to communicate with this word? Don't assume based on your 21st century understanding, but look at the world of the Bible first. That could be a challenge. Then, number 4, we can look at political questions. What political assumptions did the biblical author have? What was the ideal ruler like for the biblical writer? Well, in the Old Testament, we know at least one ruler who was the ideal ruler, and that was King David. Over and over again, in the, for example, 1st, 2nd Kings, Chronicles, the kings are always compared to David because David was the ideal ruler. How does the distance between ideal and actual affect the meaning of the text? Well, if you are studying the historical books and you come across one of the kings and said he walked in the way of Jeroboam, or he he followed in the footsteps of his father David, there's an assumption going on there, and you need to investigate, what does it mean to follow in the footsteps of David or to follow in the footsteps of Jeroboam? Those are political questions. All biblical authors lived with a tension between the ideal political situation and the realities of politics that influence the text. So it's helpful for us to imagine in our minds what would be the ideal in this situation. The ideal for most of Israel was a king who would authentically represent God to the nation and the nation to God. And so you can read those notes there, but so for Israel, the king, a godly king who feared God and obeyed God's commands. That was the ideal king. There are very few kings actually like that. Even David struggled. In the New Testament, all the writers lived under the power of the Roman Empire. There have actually been quite a few books written in the last 5 to 10 years. A favorite word now is empire. They'll say Paul and Empire. I think that's the name of a book, actually. Paul and Empire. Empire and the Gospels, and so on, because people have become aware of how the Roman Empire stands behind a lot of the New Testament. They were the dominant power. They influenced everything, even what was going on in Jerusalem. And then in a lot of Paul's letters in the book of Acts, the persecution, and so on. So, we can ask, okay, what are the politics going on? If you're going to study the book of Acts, for example, and you're reading how Paul and his travel companions went to a certain city, while they were in that city, the leaders rose up and there was a riot. Well, you can ask political questions about that. Who is in charge? Why were they against Paul and his companions? So that's where you can investigate political questions. Number 5, economic questions. What were the economic circumstances assumed by the biblical author? How is the biblical author responding to the distance between the ideal and the actual economic circumstances of the audience? Was the culture a money exchange or a barter culture? Probably more in the Old Testament, it was a lot of barter. But we see by the time of the New Testament that they actually had Roman money. Sometimes in the Old Testament, you'll read how they weighed out talents of gold or silver. And so you can look for the economic kinds of questions. What assumptions regarding food, housing, and possessions operate in the text? How do these assumptions affect meaning? For example, Jesus said, if someone asks for a cloak, give him your tunic as well. You remember that on the Sermon on the Mount? That is an economic question. What does it mean to give someone your tunic? That was like giving them your winter coat in the middle of winter. You might not understand that in the Philippines, but if you come from a cold climate, you understand that. You just don't give your coat away. You're going to freeze to death. So, we have to understand the economic significance of giving your cloak away. Most people had only one cloak. That's the only thing they owned. They did not have a closet full of clothes. They had one clothes. And to give it away, Jesus was making a powerful statement there. So we can understand the economic situation. The middle class did not exist in the biblical world. Most people lived in abject poverty. They lived from day to day. They got paid every day. If they did not get paid, they did not eat. And so what does it mean to then pray, give us this day our daily bread? That has no meaning for us if our cabinet is full of loaves of bread today. But what happens if you have nothing to eat until you're paid And then you could go buy your little tiny loaf of bread for your family that night. That's how most people lived back then. So we have to understand the economic situation of the people. There's a lot of interesting things here in the notes. I don't think I'll read it all through, but just go ahead and read those notes. But economic situation, that can be a real significant one in a lot of passages, especially in Jesus' teachings. People have noted that Jesus talks about money more than any other topic. So if that was so important to Jesus, then let's imagine what life was like for the average person in first century Israel. It was very hard. Most people had barely enough food to eat. What impact does that have when Jesus then fed 5,000 people with basketfuls of food left over? And they were satisfied, they were filled up. Well, when was the last time their stomachs were full? It may have been weeks or months since they really had a full stomach and didn't eat all the food that was given to them. So we have to understand that situation back then was not easy to live in. So those kinds of insights, what does it do to your passage? It makes it come to life. And you just see how significant it was. We just kind of breeze through that story, and we don't even think about how significant it was. And then, another economic question related to that. Remember one of the disciples? Which one was it? I can't remember. One of the disciples said, it would take us 6 months of wages to even buy enough for, a nibble for these people. So what does that mean, to work so long? Here's another example. Do you remember the woman who came and anointed Jesus' feet with alabaster? And how much that alabaster perfume was worth? It was worth a whole year's worth of wages. So if we can understand the economic situation behind that passage, then we see just how significant the sacrifice was that she made. And she poured it all on Jesus' feet. And it bothered some of the disciples. And they thought, what a waste. We could use that money for something else. And Jesus welcomed that sacrifice from her. That's a powerful story. So we need to ask these economic questions. Number 6, educational questions. What educational assumptions operated in the lives of the biblical author and audience? Could they read, write? Well, most people couldn't read and write back then. What knowledge of Scripture was available to the audience? Well, hardly anyone had their own copy of the scrolls. Most people, if there was a scroll, it was located in the temple or maybe in the synagogue. How was it acquired? How did people come to know what the Bible said? What general knowledge of history, literature, science was available to the audience? How was it acquired? Do these issues affect the way the original audience heard the text? For example, in the Old Testament, we know that the fathers and the mothers were supposed to learn God's law and teach it to their children all the time. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Well, they didn't do very well. And so the whole nation went downhill after that. In New Testament times, most of the people could not read and write. A few could read, but not very many. Peter and John were described as unlettered men. They probably could not read and write, or if they did, not very well. By New Testament times, some synagogues were developing schools in which young boys were taught to read. So many Jewish boys, perhaps Peter and John and the other disciples, they probably went to synagogue school until maybe they were like 12 years old. And they would have learned by memorizing. They probably didn't learn very much by reading. Some would learn to read. We know that Jesus could read. Not very many synagogues had their own scrolls either. So, reading and writing, we cannot think of this in modern terms. We have to think in terms of a very rural, a very simple culture where most people were poor. Learning was done in the synagogue and in families. Most people had no access to a written copy of Scripture. So how did they come to know God's laws? They were ignorant. So a lot of people had to be taught the contents of the Bible orally. That's probably how the early church learned the teachings of Jesus. For probably the first 30, perhaps 40 years, they learned Jesus' words by oral. There was no Gospels written yet. So how did people learn the Scripture? They would pass it down from generation to generation. But what happens if one generation failed? Then every generation after that would fail. We know that happened in ancient Israel because the book of the law was lost, and it was found in the temple by King Josiah, and it was read again, and it brought about a revival. So you can ask these kinds of educational questions. Sometimes we come down hard on the ancient people because they did not keep God's law. Well, why didn't they keep God's law? Because they were not teaching it to their children. They failed. Number 7, religious questions. What religious and theological assumptions of the biblical text are different from those you hold? What view of God or gods is assumed by the author and the audience? What was the religious culture that the biblical author and audience either accepted or struggled against? For example, in the Old Testament, Israel struggled against idolatry and the influence of the pagan cults and religions around Canaan. Is the view of the author different from the view of the audience? That can be true. Some of the prophets, their view was different from the people of Israel because the people had wandered away, and the prophets had the correct view. How does their context in a polytheistic world, polytheistic means many gods, affect the original audience's understanding of the text? What theologically and spiritually formative activities would be part of the audience's life? That would include prayer, meditation, singing, those types of things. The religious question of the ancient world was between polytheism and monotheism. Look at the Old Testament. Most of the time, Israel, unfortunately, is polytheistic. But the true, genuine faith was monotheistic. There's one God, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. One God, not many gods. So that's the big conflict in the Old Testament between polytheism and monotheism. And the same is true to an extent in the New Testament also. So much of Israel's history was a battle between single devotion to Yahweh as Israel's God and the worship of many false gods of the neighboring people. That's a good thing to remember as you read a lot of the Old Testament. That's the basic conflict. What do the prophets do? They call people back to devotion to Yahweh. Also, we could ask the kind of religious questions. How much did the people of the Bible know about God? They didn't have any Bible to read, and few people could even read. How did they grow spiritually? Who taught them? Were they obedient? And so on. The last area, customs or life questions. What general cultural customs were different for the biblical writer and audience? What assumptions about marriage, birthing, death, clothing, work, leisure, family life, and so on? How did these things influence the text? We can also look at the customs related to birth, marriage, and death. You know, those significant life moments in a person's life. You know, how did people respond to that? You know, you might be studying Matthew chapter 25 and the parable of the 10 virgins. It'd be very good to learn about ancient or marriage practices in the first century Jewish world. That would help you interpret that parable. Births took place at the home of the mother, and she would be assisted by a midwife or two. So, you know, birth, and then male children were circumcised at 8 days after birth, and then that's when they were named. It appears in the New Testament times a boy went through a rite of passage into manhood at his 13th birthday and became a son of the law. Modern Jews call that the bar mitzvah, which is what that means, son of the law. Also, we can see during menstrual cycles, that's when girls transition to marriage or womanhood. And so on. Marriages, a lot of them were arranged by the parents. They could be married at a very young age, anywhere from girls 11 or 12 and boys from 13 to 17. They would be engaged, and then you know, after a few years, then be married. And so some of this would help us understand the birth of Jesus and so on. Okay, so these are just suggestions. Not all of these will fit your particular passage. So what you do is you just kind of use your imagination. You could use these notes and look at some of these questions and see if you can determine anything relevant to your passage. Background research. Because social scientific exegesis is a relatively recent development in biblical studies, the resources are still in the process of development. You can look up different kinds of books like Manners and Customs of Bible Times, or, you know, ancient culture and what was life like, and so on. There's a series of books called A Socio-Rhetorical Commentary on, you know, a book of the New Testament. Those are very helpful. They have lots of insights about the culture. Sometimes you can look up these ideas in a Bible encyclopedia or a Bible dictionary. Sometimes a commentary may have some ideas also. Okay, so let's review these. Asking careful questions of the cultural background of a passage can help us better understand the words of the passage. You can ask these types of questions. Worldview. The general values or outlook of those in a text or in a past society at large. Value and meaning. What was important to the people at that time? Societal structures, marriage, family patterns, roles of men and women. For example, married children with women with who were married but had no children. Physical features, climate, weather, how people got around. You know, you could include things like geography. What is it? How is it significant if there's a drought in the land? You know, it's a dry place there. Economic structures, how people made a living, wealth versus poverty, slavery, economic mobility. Political climate, governing structures, loyalties among groups and leaders, behavior patterns, customs, dress, religious structures, practices, power centers, beliefs, rituals, affiliations. So this is called the cultural context. It can be challenging with some passages. Some passages it might be really small, if even, it might not even be a very big issue. You might not even be able to find anything on your passage. But other passages, it can be really important to look at the cultural context of your passage. You have to use a little bit of wisdom and gain more experience in using this step of interpretation. And you will become more familiar with the types of questions to address. The literary context is the passages around your particular passage that you are studying. Now we begin to look inside the text. So far, historical and cultural exegesis, we're trying to understand the world behind the text. The world that we look through and beyond the actual words. Now we're going to start looking at the actual words printed on the page. We're going to go inside the text, if you can just think of it that way. Literary exegesis begins with the largest literary unit, the whole Bible, and it gradually works down till we get to the individual words of the text. We look at it from the biggest angle that we can, and then we focus in like a microscope to look at the small parts. The literary context is what surrounds the words and a passage of the Bible. The most basic way to study a piece of writing is to look at its context. It is difficult to understand the meaning of a word by itself. It must be used with other words. So we look at the context. So it's helpful for us to determine the basic unit of the material. That's why with some of your passages, when I looked at them, I thought, well, maybe they need to include a few more verses because you were only getting part of the passage. So Bible scholars often use the word pericope. That's how you pronounce that, pericope. Sometimes when I type this, Microsoft Word wants to change it to periscope, but it's called pericope. Pericope would be like the unit. It might be a parable, it might be a paragraph, or something like that. So let's look at this with what is called circles of context. Right at the center, we have our passage, our text. Maybe we have 5 or 10 verses or something like that. Then around this, we have the immediate context. That might be the chapter. Let's say we want to preach on the beatitudes or study the beatitudes. I think someone in our class is going to do some of the beatitudes. Okay, so that's your text, beatitude. The immediate context would be the Sermon on the Mount. And then we could look at the book as a whole, the book of Matthew. How does Matthew influence my passage? Then we keep going out. Books by the same author. Well, this might be like if you're studying one of Paul's letters, you can look at his whole thought in all of his letters. Then you go out to even wider to the same testament. This would be the New Testament, the Old Testament. And then you go to the whole Bible. So you work your way out and you work your way in. The more you study the Bible, the more you understand these contexts. And the more insight you will gain about your individual passage. There are some things we can do. to help us study the context and some things to look for. It is important to study the literary context of a passage for several reasons. One, it helps us understand the flow of thought of the author. Sometimes the author is building a sequence, a case. Paul the Apostle does this a lot in his letters. You cannot just take one part or one paragraph in isolation from everything else, because Paul has been building a case for 2 or 3 chapters, especially, for example, in the book of Romans. You cannot read chapter 8 without reading chapters 5, 6, and 7. And you cannot read chapters 5, 6, and 7 without reading chapter 4, or without reading chapters 1, 2, 3. So very important in Romans to read it carefully by sequence. Okay, it shows us the flow of thought of the author. Letter B, it provides a more accurate meaning of words. Words will have different meanings, and they will be like, they'll be in a circle. I'm not sure, I don't think I put a diagram in here later. We'll get to words here in a word study probably next week. We'll focus on word studies. But a word will have a general meaning, but within that general meaning, there could be like 10 different meanings. So the context will determine which of these meanings best fits what the author intended. So that's called the semantic domain. The context will help us determine what that particular word means, what the author was intending with that particular word. So it can be helpful with a word study. Letter C, context shows how different sections of the Bible are related to each other. For example, there might be some of Paul's letters are related to one another, or John's letters seem to be very much, their meaning is wrapped up together. Remember that the original manuscripts of the Bible did not have chapter or verse numbers. Those are added many, many centuries later in the Middle Ages by different people. There's a legend that, what's his name? The one who put the verse divisions in. I forget his name. I have to look it up. The legend is that he was riding his horse as he put the numbers in. And wherever the horse jumped is where he put the verse number in. That's why some of the verse numbers seem to be in odd places. Well, when it comes to reading the Bible, just forget the paragraph divisions and the verse numbers and the chapter divisions, okay? They're helpful for us as references, but the original authors did not have any of that. So, for us as beginners, it's helpful to use the paragraph divisions in a modern study Bible or translation. They can be helpful, but don't always trust those because those are not necessarily inspired. The words are inspired. When the New Testament was written and the Old Testament, they did not even have spaces in between words. It all just flowed, letter after letter after letter. So those are all modern inventions. The challenges. Number one, most people do not study the Bible with a whole book or section in mind. They often look only at a single verse, or at best, a paragraph or a small unit. It's good. Remember when we talked about reading, the first thing you do after you pray and then you read. Why is it important to read the whole book nonstop? Because then you see the whole context. And then you can see how your passage fits into the whole biblical book. Studying context can be challenging because readers must keep in mind the larger themes of the whole book. That's why it's helpful to do what's called a book level survey. Write down the 3 to 5 major ideas in that book. Create some kind of basic outline. then you can see where your passage fits into that. Well, how do we study context? Here are some suggestions. We'll try to do this before we take a break. You should have already read through your passage and the entire book several times in your earlier study. If not, then do that first. First, identify the limits of your passage. Where does it begin and end? To do this, you need to read the surrounding context. Here's some ways you can tell. Look for major shifts in the topic of discussion. Is there a shift in audience that is addressed? Change in literary type or genre? Change in key words or repeated themes? There's a change in verbal characteristics, for example, the tense, voice, and so on of the verbs. We'll talk about those in a little while. A shift in time and place. Transition words like so or therefore, or things like for. Those types of words will indicate that there's a little break going on there. And then, so first of all, you find out where does your passage begin and end that you're going to study. Second, determine the purpose of the book as a whole. You may need to consult a Bible introduction or a study Bible for this. This is to help you get the big picture. Why did Paul write 1 Corinthians? So, well, go look it up in a Bible introduction. Introduction to the New Testament or something like that. So you understand why Paul wrote that letter. Then you can do a book survey. What is a book survey? There are two ways to read for surveying the book. One is rapid word-for-word reading. You read every word, but you do it quickly, and you don't stop to think about it. Don't get mired. That's a word that means stuck. Don't get stuck in the details. All you want to do is to understand the big picture. There's another way you can do that. You might want to do both of these. The other way is to skim or to scan. You don't read every word. You just kind of like, I have a Bible here and I'm going to study 1 Corinthians. I've read through it already, but now I'm just going to kind of flip through the pages. Where is 1 Corinthians here? Okay. There we are. So I'm just going to flip through the pages. I think, okay, yeah, this chapter, yeah, it's talking about, and a lot of Bibles, like I use the NIV here. I don't know if you see that or if you have my camera enabled there. But this Bible has headings on it, and that can be a helpful thing. So I know, okay, chapter 3, the church and its leaders. Okay, chapter 6, lawsuit among believers. Okay, chapter 9, Paul's talking about his rights. Chapter 13, the love chapter. So you skim through it until you come to understand the basic idea of the book. So read it fast or scan it. I like to do both, actually. Read it through once and then scan it through just to help your mind see the little pieces. Okay, read the entire book in one sitting without stopping. That can be a little challenging with some of the big Old Testament books. Most of the New Testament books you can read within 1 hour. Some of them you can read in about 5 minutes. The book of Acts, that might be 2 hours. But read it through without stopping. Your goal is simply to observe, and not to interpret. Realize that your ideas and impressions may change as you study the book and passage in more detail. Now you want to begin to take some notes. I would suggest you use a notebook or use the computer. And you want to start to think about, okay, what is this book really about? Is it biographical? Is it about one person or persons? Like Samuel is the key person in 1 Samuel. Jesus is the key person in Mark. Is it historical? Is it talking about events like the book of Numbers? Is it chronological? It's telling about how things happened in sequence. It's organized by time. Is it organized geographically? You know, like the book of Joshua, they go from one place to another, to another, to another. The book of Acts talks about how Christianity spread. So it's a geographical organization. Another type of organization is ideological. It is organized by ideas, like the preaching of Amos or Paul's very structured and complex argument in the book of Romans. So just try to get a basic idea. Okay, is this a story? Or is this some kind of sequence? Or is it logical, step-by-step argumentation, or what? Okay, so now you've kind of got a basic idea of what the book is. Now you want to go back and give each chapter of the book a book title. A chapter title, I'm sorry. Give each chapter a title. This will give you a brief overview of the entire book. Characteristics of a good title. Make it very few words. One word if possible, maybe no more than 3 words. So I would title 1 Corinthians 13, I would say love. Chapter 12, I'd say spiritual gifts. Chapter 14, tongues or prophecy. Chapter 15, resurrection. Or you could say resurrection of the dead or resurrection of the body. So you give every chapter in the book 1 or 3 word title. And I would suggest you take these words directly from the passage. Don't make them fancy. Just you read through that chapter and a key word helps you summarize it. Now don't cheat and use the ones that are in your study Bible. Come up with your own. And it will have more meaning for you. So when you're done, you now have every chapter of this book in just 1 or 2 or 3 words, a list. And you could tell what the book is about now in a very short list. Unless you have a very complex Old Testament book, which is, I just finished reading the book of Ezekiel with my daughter. I tell you, we were not very blessed by that book. It's very complex. It's like, okay, the last chapter, talking about the divisions of the land and everything. So a book like Ezekiel would be very challenging to do a book survey. But most of the New Testament books, you could do a book survey. The nice thing about doing that is you've done it once, keep notes on it, and you won't have to do that again, ever in your life, unless you want to improve on it. Okay, now we want to go back and study the structure. The structure is the arrangement and organization of the content. How are the various parts of this book put together? How do they relate to one another? Now we want to take our chapter titles and divide them up even and organize them. Organize these into bigger sections. Most books can be organized into like 3 to 5 sections. In 1 Corinthians, for example, I've studied this book quite a bit. Chapters 1 to 4 are one section. Chapters 5 through 7. Chapter 8 through 10. Chapter 11 through 14. Chapter 15 is kind of on its own. And so 1 Corinthians has maybe 5 or 6 sections to it. So think of this as the beginning, middle, and the end. Don't worry about the number of sections for larger books. It can get very complex. Give each section a label or a title. Basically, what you are creating is an outline of the book in your own terms, in your own way, your own thinking. How can you determine what a section is? Well, look for major shifts in topic. I know in 1 Corinthians, chapters 8 through 10 deal with food sacrificed to idols and how the Corinthians need to work with each other about that. So that's kind of, I can see that topic is right there. Chapters maybe 12 through 14 talk about spiritual gifts. So you can see how there's a big shift in topic. Think about how a unit might be structured. Look for introductory or concluding elements put there by the author. Well, Paul in 1 Corinthians, he will have a little phrase he uses. Now about the things that you wrote. So he says, now about. That's an indicator he's starting a new section of the letter. Sometimes there'll be an indicator like that. Now you might have to go back to your chapter titles and fix them a little bit. If it's easier to identify subunits, do this first, and then force yourself to combine them into larger groupings until you have only 3 to 5 major units. Use a variety of formats to help you. You can use an outline. It's always interesting when a student will create a chart, a drawing, a graph. Sometimes people will create like they will do a story plot highlight. You know how the plot will grow and conflict, and then at the end it is resolved. So, that would make an interesting way to look at a book of the Bible, and you can just write in the chapter numbers there and the titles. You can make a very creative study of your book. Again, once you do this, it can become a key resource for you whenever you study that book again. You only need to do this one time. You could always go back and fix it, add to it. If you did this 66 times, you'd have the whole Bible outlined. There's your challenge. Outline the whole Bible. It might take you a couple of years, but what a resource that would be for you. Okay, let's move on. So now you've got the big picture of the book, you got the sections, you got the titles. Now you want to look at your particular passage. Okay? I had started looking, I told you last week, at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And I was going to look at chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. Now, to understand the context, I need to go back to chapter 4, verses 1 through 16, and then chapter 5, probably verses 1 through 11. So I've got the previous section, I've got my passage, and then I've got the following passage. Now, I want to summarize each of those sections in a very short little phrase. So the previous section, I'm going to cheat a little bit here because I can't think very well and talk at the same time and watch the computer. But basically, Paul is talking about how they should live to please God. Okay, so previous section, living a holy life, a sanctified life, pleasing God. Okay, my section, Paul talks about those believers who have died. The following section, he talks about when Jesus will come again. So now I understand that this passage that I'm studying is between holiness and between the second coming. Okay, so that kind of gives me an idea. Ask the following types of questions to determine how your passage is influenced by its context and how the context gives deeper meaning to your passage. What is the purpose of the passage in its context? How does your passage fit in the immediate context, the context of the book, and the context of the entire Bible? Now, this is where you got to do some thinking now. This part may not be real easy. You got to ask this question. Okay, what is my passage saying about, or how does my passage help understand the previous passage? Or how does it respond to the previous passage? How does my passage prepare for the one that's coming up? How does the next passage reflect on my passage? This may change. It might be kind of a logical sequence. It might be historical. It might be part of a story. And so you'll get the ending of the story in the next passage, for example, or something like that. And so this will, the type of literary genre, we'll talk about that next week, that will determine a little bit about your passage also. Okay, let me give you an example, another example. In Jesus' teachings in the Gospels, the literary context can be very important because what Jesus says in one passage will be related to what's going on all around. For example, in Mark chapter 8, this is a famous passage where Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ. If I only read chapter 8, verses 27 through 30, and this is where Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah, I need to understand that this comes actually in a passage where the disciples seem to be confused about Jesus. And then in the next passage, Jesus talks about he predicts his death, and Peter, the one who just confessed Jesus, now rebukes Jesus. And then Jesus talks about taking up our cross. All of these are related. And so we need to understand the whole flow of the passage, and not just our little passage about Peter proclaiming Jesus to be the Messiah. We say, oh yeah, Peter, good job. Well, in the next passage, he gets rebuked. He really has no idea what he's talking about. So we have to be careful that we don't miss out on what the passage is really trying to communicate. What about a verse that's by itself, such as in Proverbs? In these cases, the literary context is very small, if at all. Sometimes you might have a proverb that really has no context at all. Sometimes it might be related generally to the ones around it. So not every passage is the context really big. But most of the time you can pick up some kind of clue that will help you understand your passage. So you begin by going from broad to narrow, from the big part of the circle down to the small part, and then you work your way back out from your passage to the whole message of the Bible. Each one of those rings will help you understand your passage more. You might want to return to this part of your study later on. Each one of these steps of exegesis, it's not like you finish it forever. You start it and then you might come back to it because you have some more ideas of how you can do this. Okay, let me just define this real quick. Intertextuality, that's a technical term in biblical study. It means that one book in the Bible quotes from another book. Most of the time that would be the New Testament quoting the Old Testament. Sometimes the author of the New Testament passage does not consider the Old Testament context at all. Sometimes it does. And we have to go back and look at the Old Testament context of that passage. And it can get a little complex for that, but I don't want to mention too much about that at this point. Word studies. Now we're going to get into the small details of a passage of Scripture. These details can be studied using different methods. And today, we'll focus on word studies. Next week, we'll do grammatical analysis and syntax analysis. Those will be maybe some new things for you next week. But I'll give you all the tools I can think of in a simple way. Some of them you will use, some of them you may not. So word studies seek to determine the meaning that an individual word carries in a text. The key idea, the meaning of the words in their context. Then next week, we'll look at how words are used in a sentence. The key idea is defining the parts of the sentence. Syntax analysis examines the structure of paragraphs and sentences by looking how phrases and clauses are used in these sentences and paragraphs. The key idea, relationships of the parts. We have the small parts, word by word by word. Then we see how words are related sentence by sentence. And then we see how the different parts, perhaps in a whole paragraph, are related to one another. Words are the smallest part of language that has meaning. Words are just simply combinations of symbols and sounds. If you do not know what that sound means or that symbol means, it's meaningless to you. You might look at a Greek or Hebrew word and it's meaningless to you until you know what those symbols mean. The sound of a word, there's a lot of Tagalog words. They just sound like a bunch of syllables to me. It's like, wow, that word must be 10 syllables long. I lost it. I'm not sure what it is. I think that's why a lot of Filipinos use English words, because they're shorter and easier. So, Taglish. All language is metaphorical. That a word represents an idea that is communicated through the organization of sounds and symbols. Every word we speak represents something else. So we need to figure out, what is that word, the sound of that word or the letters, what is that actually trying to say? Usage will determine which sound or symbols have meanings to a language. Meanings of words change over time. That's true in every language. Here's an example. Oftentimes in English, words will be destroyed. I'll just put it bluntly. The meaning of a word is ruined by how people use it. The original meaning of the word gay means happy. I grew up watching a cartoon show called The Flintstones. I don't know if you've ever seen that little comic, Fred Flintstone. And I would come home from school, and if we had a TV, always didn't have a TV, but sometimes we had a TV, and I'd go and turn the TV on so I could watch The Flintstones. And at the end of the cartoon, it always said, "We have a gay old time, Flintstones." I don't know if you've ever seen that cartoon, but it's so long ago, I don't think people even know what it is. But anyway, so that word simply meant happy. Nowadays, what does gay mean? It means homosexual. It's like, where do you get that? I mean, it's just totally not where the word came from. And so, words, the meaning of words will change over time. And it depends how people use that word. The same is true in ancient times and biblical words. We need to understand what the word meant at that time by that particular author. How do we do that? Well, we'll talk about how we do that, but we can use some study aids, concordances, lexicons, and theological dictionaries will help us do that. First of all, we start with translation. The first step is to translate the word or the sentence from the original Greek and Hebrew. Well, what happens if you don't know Greek, Aramaic, or Hebrew? You can use an interlinear. And so if you do not know how to use an interlinear, then you can consult multiple translations in your language or English. I showed you this the other day. So let me give you some examples. I'm going to bring up for you my Logos software. I am actually doing my daily blog on 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I just wrote up the one today on verse 7. Now, I'm going to show you the three levels of this, okay? I don't expect very many or any of you to be able to work with the Greek, but I can. And if I don't know the word, I can look it up. So panta stege, panta pistue, panta elpitze, panta hupamene. Okay, well, I translated, I know this already. So love, which is the assumed subject, always, well, stege, I don't know what that means. So I look down here at the little window that pops up. It says to bear or to endure. Okay, so it always endures, it always believes, it always hopes, and it always endures. I have a little cheat down there at the bottom. I don't know if you can see that little pop-up window. When I hover over a particular word, it shows me what that is. Now, what I can do with this particular software is, let's say I don't know what this word is. I click on that, and it pops up on the left side to a lexicon. It's called the Greek English Lexicon of the New Testament and Other Christian Literature. Bauer, Danker, Frederick William. This is the most famous, most widely used Greek English lexicon. And it will give me the definition. Stego means to keep confidential, cover, pass over in silence. To bear up against difficulties, bear, stand, endure. So here they put 1 Corinthians 13:7 under the first definition. Okay, it means of love that throws a cloak of silence over what is displeasing in another person. So love that covers over what is displeasing in another person. That's what Harnack says in whatever that was in 1911. Okay, so this is a lexicon. I can do a word study on any of these. Now, this software costs me a lot of money, but there are some free versions out there. So I want to say, okay, what's pistue? Pistuo. You have to skip all these things, come down here. To consider something to be true, therefore worthy of one's trust or believe. They put this passage under this definition. To believe, be convinced of something, that which one believes. So these lexicons can be pretty complex to kind of wade through all these references and so on. This is a really important New Testament word, as you can tell by all these passages. So this is probably one of the longest definitions in this entire book, is this one. So there's a whole bunch here. Okay, so that's what I would say high level. You would have to go probably to Bible college and seminary and study Greek for probably at least 2 years to be able to operate this level of study. Since not very many people are able to do that, let's go on to the second level. Now, this level is one that you can do. So let's open up our internet browser. And we can go to blueletterbible.org. Right? So I showed you this one the other day. Let's put in our passage, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7. And let's use the New King James Version because I was using that. The New King James Version is one of the more literal translations. So let's go to that. How come? Where's? Oh, there it is. Sorry. Okay. 1 Corinthians 13, 7. Now I can just click on that and it brings up an interlinear. Now, I don't know what these Greek words are. I don't even know how to read Greek. But I do know what the English is. Oh, it gives me King James Version. I don't really want King James Version. Let's do the ESV. It might only, because this is a free resource, it may only have the King James Version. Okay. I can go over here under Tools. And it gives me interlinear. It can give me Bibles, cross-references, commentaries, dictionaries, miscellaneous. All right. Let's just use the interlinear. Now, I don't know what these Greek words are at all. I can't even read Greek. But I can read, it gives me the NASB, that's okay. I can read the English over here. So now I can look at, here at the beginning, okay, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Okay, so that's the literal English. Now let's say I want to do a word study, and I want to investigate this word bears. I can come over here, and it will give me the Strong's number. So the G represents the Greek New Testament. If it was the Old Testament, it would have an H in front of it, so it would be the Hebrew word. Every word in the Greek New Testament will have a number to it. Well, this gives me what that word is. I may not know how to read the Greek, but here's the transliteration. And I can come over here and it will pronounce it for me.
Strong's G 4722, stego. Okay. Stego.
Stego. So that's how I pronounce it. Now, the parsing, that tells me that it's a verb. Oh, you see that little pop-up window? It's pretty small on my screen. It says, from the root stego, Greek 4722. It is a verb, present active indicative, third person singular, English, bears. Well, once you do study a little bit of Greek, I could teach you enough Greek in about 2 or 3 hours that you know what all those mean, but we don't have time for that. So maybe someday you will be able to understand what those mean. But at this point, you might not know what those mean. So let's not worry about that over there. What will be helpful, though, for our word study is that we can click on this Strong's Greek word. So let's click on that. Okay, now this will give us basically a very short version of a lexicon. And then later on here, it gives us a little bit longer. This gives us Thayer's Greek lexicon, which is, looks like, yeah, Thayer's. Thayer's is good. It's not as significant as the one that I have in my Logos software, but this is good enough. It's all free. Now, I don't need to worry about the Greek too much because I don't need to impress anyone with what it is. But I do want to come down here and begin to look at the definitions. Okay, it can mean a deck, thatch, to cover, to protect or keep by covering, or to preserve. So this is what's called the semantic domain. These are all the possibilities. The basic idea of it is that it's something that covers, all right? So it could be used as a covering of a deck or a thatched roof, or it could mean something that covers over with silence, or to be keep secret, or to hide. Or it means covering to keep off something which threatens, to bear up against, to hold up against, and so to endure, bear, or forbear. Now, when we do a word study, we want to look at all of these and try to understand, what does this word really mean in its context in this chapter? It's obviously not talking about a roof, a thatched roof, or a deck. No, that's not it. It seems to be more like covering up something so that it is protected. So maybe endure, hiding something. Here it says to roof over, figuratively, to cover with silence, or to endure patiently. Okay, so that might be what this word means, to endure patiently. But it does help me to realize that this, basically, what does it mean to endure patiently? I'm trying to cover someone, like a roof. I'm trying to protect them from suffering. Now, do you see how this word study is enriched by looking at the definition? So I can come down here and it gives me Thayer's Greek lexicon. To protect or keep by covering, or to preserve. Okay, what does it mean then if we go back to our verse? Love always covers and protects people. That's interesting, isn't it? That gives the verse a little bit different nuance, a little different meaning. Or to cover over with silence, to keep secret, to hide, or to conceal. So here they say, love covereth. That's the King James Version. Love hides and excuses the errors and faults of others. So it bears with someone. It overlooks their problems and their faults. So that's an interesting interpretation, isn't it? By covering, to keep off, to bear up against, to hold against, or to endure, bear, or forbear. So in some places, here it gives another version of that. Instead of saying love covers, here we say love bears. Well, that's a whole different meaning, isn't it? So you see how translation is always a matter of interpretation. The translators always have to determine what word they're going to use. And so we see that there's probably 5 or 6 different words that we could use here. And we as translators have to decide. Okay, so that's doing a very simple word study using this free resource. So again, we put the verse in, up here in Blue Letter Bible. We go to Tools, and we can go to the interlinear, and it will show us the Strong's number for us to do a word study. All right, well, let's say you struggle with this a little bit. This would be the second level. Okay, so if you cannot work with the Greek, or maybe you don't have a big lexicon to work with, you can use these free resources on the internet. Now let's go to a third level, and let's go to BibleGateway.com. Let's say you just get confused with all of the Greek and Hebrew and all of that. You just don't know how to do that. Well, you can simply do a word study with putting in the passage. Okay, this is a little big. I need to shrink it a little bit. There we go. I just put it up here, my particular verse. It says New King James Version. Now, what I want to look for is right here. It says 1 Corinthians 13:7 in all English translations. This will not work with other translations. You have to do other ones, each of them by themselves. But here we can do all English. So that's helpful. Now we can see, what do all these translations do with this? Okay, beareth all things, bears all things, beareth, bears. Here's a different one. Love puts up with all things. Okay, that's a little bit different. It kind of has the same idea. Okay, bears. Here's a little bit different. Always supportive. And now we're starting to understand some differences. I might even just make a list of these, in my notes. Okay, bears, never gives up on people. That's a little bit broader translation. Love never gives up on people. Okay, bears. Here it says patiently accepts all things. That's a little bit different translation too. The, what is that one called? I'm not sure. The Good News version. It says, it suffereth all things. Well, that's not in my vocabulary. I'll skip that one. Okay, never stops being patient. That's a different idea, isn't it? Than some of these others. Never gives up, bears, patiently accepts all things. Love knows no limit to its endurance. Phillips is more of a paraphrase, but sometimes I find the paraphrase is helpful. Knows no limit to its endurance. That means it's going to stick with it. It's not going to give up. Okay, bears. Okay, if you love someone, you will be loyal to him no matter what the cost. Okay, this is obviously a paraphrase, but it helps me understand. Okay, so love has something to do with loyalty. The message. If I give everything we have to go. This is down here. The message doesn't really go verse by verse. It goes paragraph by paragraph. So we have to go looking for it. Maybe it's this right here. Puts up with anything. I think that's probably what that is. Puts up with anything. So you get the idea of what you could do. I don't want to go through all of these because there's a whole bunch. There's probably, 30 or 40 different English translations. And I would just take a note, maybe write it down, or you could copy and paste this into a document, especially the ones that are different. I often would use one as comparison, so I use the ESV a lot and maybe the NIV a lot. And so I would copy and paste those into my notes. And then I would look for some that really helped me understand this better. And some of those ones that I highlighted. So this is another way you could do a word study, is you just see what different translations do with it. And by doing that, you start to get a broader idea of the word. Now, there's another way to do this. And this will be the fourth way. So let's go to the translation I use all the time, English Standard Version, and just look up this verse. Okay, so love bears all things. I'm going to put in the word bears here, and I'm going to do a concordance search. A concordance is where every time that word is used in that translation, it will show up in a list. So I'm going to put bears here. Or I might just shorten that to bear. You could say, bears, or just put bear in there. I like to use a shorter version. So do a search. These are all the times that word appears in the Bible. Well, I will probably focus on the New Testament, but I would especially start with the book of the Bible. So let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I click on that. 1 Corinthians. Okay, but now I'm writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother. I'm not sure that's the same word. Okay. Love bears all things. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image. I think this is a different type of use of the word bear. You know, as I think about it, probably a concordance search on this word is not going to be very helpful to me. I don't think I'm going to, I do not want to go through 322 occurrences of this word. That's just going to waste my time. I'm not going to go through 107 times. I don't think it's really going to help me in my Bible study. How do I know that? From my past experience. All right? I've done this so many times, I just get a sense that this is not going to be a major word for me to worry about. Let's look at this though. 1 Corinthians 13. Let's just look at the whole passage. Now, I forgot to tell you one thing. You may not be able or want to study every single word in your passage. I would suggest you pick 3 or 4 words that are really important theologically. If you knew what that word meant, it would help you understand the passage more. Well, this particular passage is really loaded. I mean, it has a lot of words like love is patient, maybe the word arrogant, maybe believes or endures. Not all passages are like that. Let's choose a different passage. Let's just go to the one I've been talking about. There's 1 Thessalonians 4. Whoops. My spell checker always messes me up there. Okay, 1 Thessalonians 4. This is going to be my passage I'm studying. The first thing I want to do is determine what words are important enough for me to do a word study. So I'm just going to read it through. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep. We did talk about the other day that asleep seems to be some kind of metaphor. Oh, I guess I can't do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this into a Word document. I did that the other day, but I'm going to do a new one just so that we have it for our working example. I copied and pasted my passage in here just to make it easier for us. So I'm going to read through this and identify some important words that I think I'd like to understand. Okay, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who do not have hope. I always look for big theological words. Hope is a big one. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring us with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, so that we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another in these words. Okay, there's a couple of words that I think would be important for me to study. If I haven't studied them before. Died and rose again. I'm not sure. I'll just mark it, but I know enough that I probably won't go too deep into that. So Paul keeps using the word asleep here. I don't know if I would actually do a deep word study on that, but I am curious. He's using, what do you call it? An idiom. He's using a Greek idiom here, and basically means they died. Okay. But there was a word down here. The dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up. I know enough about this passage that is a big word. Caught up is the word we get rapture from. So I know I need to do a little word study on that. What does rapture mean? Because it's so controversial. And so I want to do a little study on that. Encourage. That seems to be an important word here. Encourage. I'm not sure how many of these are really, like big words that I might not identify the key word until I, do some other steps of exegesis, or maybe when I read a commentary. So some passages, like 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 7, every other word, you could look up. If you get a story or a narrative, you may only have one or two words to look up. I mean, they're not really difficult words. But if you have a really theological passage, let's look at one just for an example. Let's see here. Let me look up Romans chapter 3. Here is another passage. I'm just going to copy and paste it into this same document that I'm screen sharing. Okay, this is Romans chapter 3, verses 21 through 26. Let's identify all the key theological words here. All right, but now the righteousness, that's a big one, isn't it, of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction. I'm not sure. This is a hard translation to work with. For all have sinned. Sin, that's a big one. And fall short of the glory. Glory, that's a big word in the Bible, isn't it? And are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption. Look at all these words. Whom God put forward as a propitiation. Wow, I don't even know what the English word means. By his blood to be received by faith. We already have faith. This was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance. Wow, that's another English word I don't know. That's why I don't use the ESV when I preach, because I don't even know the English words. The NIV would be a lot easier here. He had passed over former sins. We already did sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and justifier. Those probably come from the same word. Okay, now look at this passage. If I were doing a serious study of Romans chapter 3, look at how many words are what I call big theological words in this passage. It is loaded. My whole study just might be about the words. As I look these up, and so let's just take the word righteousness. Let's go back to our concordance. I like to use it's so nice to have the internet resources like this. It's free, it's fast. So now I'm going to put in the word righteousness. Okay. This word does not occur quite as many times in the New Testament. It's quite a few in the Old Testament, but that's a Hebrew word. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to focus in on the New Testament for now. Okay, it doesn't occur very much in the Gospels and Acts. Notice that. It doesn't even occur in Mark. But look in Romans. Of the 86 times in the New Testament, 31 of them are in Romans. And the rest of the New Testament is just only a couple of times each book. Do you get the idea that this is an important word in the book of Romans? So I'm going to click on Romans there. And this will give me every time this particular word occurs, at least in this translation. And then I can go back and look at this. Romans 1:17. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As is written, the righteous will live by faith. So from my study of Romans, I know that this is one of the key verses. It tells me what the whole book is about. That's just in the title of 3:1. Okay, so we see here, but if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Oh, that's not helpful. Okay, so it occurs 4 times in just this passage I'm studying. Well, we can go on to chapter 4, and we find out that Abraham was considered righteous by his faith. So righteousness comes by faith, and Abraham's our example. So it occurs a whole bunch of times in chapter 4. In chapter 5, we can see that righteousness is a gift of God's grace to us. And so you go on and you just kind of pick a few passages here, especially in the context of chapter 3. And you begin to understand what righteousness is all about just by looking at these verses. So we know that we're not made righteous by the law, but we're made righteous through faith in Jesus Christ. And it's by his blood. We might even try a different translation and see what, if we have any interesting discoveries. So that's the kind of things we can do with a word study. Let's go back to our notes. These are the tools I use all the time. I even use them for my academic writing. As I use Bible Gateway. I use that every day. I'm always on this. I may not always do a concordance search like this, but sometimes I do. Textual criticism is where the ancient manuscripts would have some difference there. They would have a different, what's called reading. Reading is a technical term for the actual words in the document. So textual criticism, it's a very detailed science, and there's not very many people who actually are able to do that. Some people will devote their entire lives to studying ancient manuscripts, and they will compare the manuscripts and try to get as close as they can to the original. We do not have the original manuscripts. We do not have the letters that Paul wrote. We only have copies of copies. The most ancient manuscripts we have are just little tiny pieces from the 2nd century. They're called little papyri pieces. It's not until the 3rd or 4th century that we get full books of the Bible. And so those manuscripts are very important. But over time, as the manuscripts were hand copied, sometimes differences show up. And so textual critics, that's what they're called. This is just a technical term. They will spend a lot of time comparing the ancient manuscripts and to arrive at the closest to the original. Most of the time, it only might be a couple of words difference. So it's not a big deal, but there are some passages. Let's take a look. Let me open up our concordance again, and I'll just point out one of the bigger passages. John chapter 8. You see here it says, the earliest manuscripts do not include chapters 7:53 through 8:11. This is a textual problem. Textual critics have compared ancient manuscripts, and the oldest manuscripts, they don't have this added. It shows up, I think it shows up around the 3rd or 4th century in the manuscript traditions. So is it part of our Bible? Well, the church has received it and accepted it, so it's part of our Bible. But just to realize that it is a textual problem. There's another one that's a big one, and that's the end of Mark, chapter 16. If you open that in a modern Bible, it will say, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include verses 9 through 20. Again, this is a textual problem. And most modern Bibles, especially if it's a study Bible, will give some kind of footnote. Now, there might be other places that you're reading along and you see a little footnote, and it will say at the bottom, some manuscripts have this word, okay? I'm not sure if they do this one. Let me see if this one is present. Romans chapter 5. Therefore, we have been justified by faith. We have peace, okay? Where it says we have peace, footnote A. Some manuscripts say, let us have peace. So that is, again, a manuscript problem, a textual problem. Well, I would say at this stage in your study, don't worry about those, okay? That's for very advanced Bible study. The only difference, by the way, between let us and we have, so let us is a command, we have is a statement. The only difference in Greek is one letter that almost looks the same. So somewhere along the line, there were some scribes who perhaps just slightly misplaced that letter. And then from then on, every manuscript that followed that series had that slight difference. So that's a very minor textual problem. But if you have a study Bible, you'll see these little footnotes once in a while. Some manuscripts say, let us, Romans 5:2. Some manuscripts omit by faith. All right, so that explains those footnotes. Those are called textual criticism. It's not a big deal for 99.9% of what we do in church work, okay? But just to be aware of, that's why we have those footnotes, because there are different manuscript traditions. And so I'm just going to skip all of this. This is very technical stuff, but it can be true for both Old and New Testament. So we've done our word studies. And I'm going to just skip through these notes. I think we've pretty much covered these. There's different tools we can use. The Bible, just use the Bible and look at the context. Try to determine. Another good passage is BibleHub.com. That will do a lot of the same things as Blue Letter Bible. It's another resource that has a lot of free information. So you might want to bookmark that in your internet browser and go use that resource. So Blue Letter Bible or Bible Hub. And then you can use a concordance. Strong's Exhaustive Concordance is really useful because all you need to know is the number. And then you can do all kinds of things. So like the blueletterbible.org, it gives us the number. If you do have some skill in Greek and Hebrew, you can use some of these. But these are pretty complex, and I would not recommend these for beginners. You'll just get confused. And then there's a theological word book. I should probably show you what these look like real quick. I'll show you an example in my Logos software. But these are a little bit more than a lexicon. A lexicon is kind of like a dictionary. But a theological word book, it'll give you like a whole 2 or 3 paragraphs that explain your word. Sometimes, if it's an important word, it'll give you like 10 or 15 pages on your word. One that I like to use, if you have available to you, is the Beacon Dictionary of Theology. It's our Nazarene one. It's probably about 30 or 40 years old now. But that's a real helpful one because it comes from our Nazarene perspective. There is a new one that's just come out, a couple of new ones, a new Dictionary Biblical Theology. It's just coming out. I haven't even seen a copy of it myself. I have a couple of articles in it, but it's also a Nazarene Dictionary of Words. Those are really helpful if you can access one of, like, the Beacon Dictionary of Theology, or Ralph Earl's Word Meanings of the New Testament. I'm not sure if that's in the WHDL. It might be. Ralph Earl was one of our early Nazarene New Testament scholars, and he wrote a book about word studies. And then you could go look at a Bible encyclopedia. Those can be helpful. Just show you one of these other resources so you know what I'm talking about. I'll go to my Logos software, and I have what's called the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. They actually have an abridged version that's a lot easier for the beginner. Okay, so this will give me the Greek word, and it will use the transliteration, not the actual Greek letters, which is helpful if you don't know the Greek letters. So I just happen to have studied at one point koinos. It gives me all of the different derivatives or words that share the same root. Most of us are familiar with koinonia, fellowship. So I can read through here how the word was used in secular Greek, Old Testament and Judaism, the individual society theories and forms of society, koinos in the New Testament. And sometimes this is broken down into different parts. It'd be like maybe the Gospels. Gives me a paragraph here about Paul, the Lord's Supper, fellowship with Christ. Gives me the word koinonia here. So this is the abridged version. If I were to go look at the full version, I'm going to have to look it up in the what was the root of that? Koinos. So I'll just show you what it looks like in the full version. It's probably about 15 or 20 pages. Koinos. Okay, this is going to give you the Greek letters. This is going to be more technical. And it starts on page 790. And it goes to page 810. This will give you 20 pages. Very complex. It'd probably take you an hour to read through all that. That's called the Theological Word Book. Very detailed. It's a whole article, a whole chapter basically, written on one word. And it can be very technical. It's not for the beginner, but very, very detailed. This gives you a kind of a shorter version of that.